In this module, we explore the nature versus human divide. Specifically, we will evaluate variation in the perceived distance separating the things of man from the things of nature. This requires understanding that there are different ways people think about their relationship with the environment. For instance, trophy hunters appear to think of themselves as not only separate from the animals they collect, but dominant to them. Perhaps there is a psychological benefit from dominating powerful, wild nature. Here is another example. This American woman became Twitter famous for attributing her sport kill of a critically endangered giraffe to divine providence. In the photograph taken on the day of the kill, she points to heaven, thanking God for the opportunity to reign supreme over this African creature. As environmental anthropologists, we may be curious to understand the belief system and layers of cultural context that inspired her to travel to Africa, get a gun, kill an endangered species, and feel so proud of herself that she tweeted about it for everyone in the world to see, and suggests that she personally knows the will of God without appearing to wrestle with any doubt. This is an example of perceived human supremacy over nature, over the wild, over wild animals. The supremacy of humans and our morally righteous domination of nature stems from a long pastoralist tradition in which animals are considered subhuman and come in two types, wild and domesticated. Wild animals belong to the land and fend for themselves. They may be considered persons spiritually, and therefore they are respected, and there is prestige attached to dominating them. Contrast that with domesticated animals, which are considered part of humanity. They belong to human stewards. They're sometimes considered family members. Human comfort may even be traded for animal welfare. And there's little prestige in dominating them. The Western cultural paradigm is rooted in this pastoralist tradition. In the US, people typically believe that mankind or culture is separate from nature. And as society, quote, advances, it moves further away from nature. This is revealed in language. Nature is considered beastly and wild. Nature is the objective thing that is studied by scientists. It can be observed, and then perhaps some human-constructed meaning is applied to it. So humans can understand it, tame it, and bend nature to our will. So in this paradigm, nature and humanity are separate spheres. Our example of the types of animals suggests that because these animals belong to these different realms, there's different prestige attached to dominating them. Now, if we consider this progression that is sometimes implicit in the Western paradigm, that as humans move away from nature, we're becoming more and more perfected, more divine. Well, this progression from things of nature like wild animals through different stages of human societal development has been historically used to justify enslavement of other groups of people, conquest, colonialism, and other isms. So perceived relatively lower placement on this imagined progression that is invented by culture provides people who ascribe to that culture justification to make proper decisions for others who they think can't be trusted to make the decisions for themselves. How might our worldview impact conservation efforts? And how might this worldview impact collaboration between nations if we're thinking about environmental policies, international environmental policies? Consider this other aspect of the Western paradigm. Nature, because it's separate from humanity, belongs out there, not in the human realm. So my example of this is spiders. I like them in my garden. They eat garden pests, but I don't want them inside my house. Natural resources can also exist as nature, but then they become reclassified as part of the human cultural sphere when I extract those resources and move them from out there into my house, into the human realm. Reclassifying nature brings it up to the level of human. It doesn't bring me down to the level of wild. Here's another example. Imagine collecting seashells at the beach, extracting them from nature, then bringing them home as a knickknack. You've reclassified the shell now as something that belongs in the human sphere. Hunting trophies are similarly common. You've reclassified this from a wild animal now into a human cultural decoration. And we do this with all sorts of natural resources that exist out there in the wild, but we reclassify them when we bring them into our homes to serve human purposes. Now that we've considered the Western paradigm, which I assume many students grew up in, as did I, now we're going to consider some alternative perspectives that contrast that. So I'm pausing here to invite you to press pause on your belief system. We've all been conditioned by society. So we're going to press pause on that conditioning while considering these other viewpoints. An anthropological hypothesis exists that a society's perspective on nature reflects its mode of subsistence. And a mode of subsistence refers to how a society feeds itself. Anthropologists recognize 4 big categories of subsistence modes: foraging, pastoralism, horticulture, and agriculture. But within these categories, foraging seems to contrast the other 3. And these other 3 have something in common. But let me explain what each of these modes of subsistence are, and then we'll look at some examples of society that fall into these categories and think about how that mode of subsistence relates to their belief system about the human versus nature divide. So foragers, I suggested, are different than the other 3 groups. This is because foragers are hunter-gatherers who rely primarily on wild plants and animals for food. So they go out and collect food, they don't store it, they don't garden, they don't keep domesticated livestock. Now contrast it with pastoralists who rely on raising herds of domesticated livestock, like cattle, or in this picture, there's a herd of goats. Horticulturalists rely on small-scale garden plots to feed themselves from their gardens, and agriculturalists, like we are in the US, have big productions. They cultivate domesticated plants and animals using technologies that allow intensive use of the land. So that's what we do in the US. What these 3 groups have in common is that they depend on successful manipulation of the environment to feed themselves, whereas foragers go out and take advantage of what happens to exist in nature. Pastoralists, horticulturalists, and agriculturalists tend herds of livestock or adjust the earth to make a garden plot or an agricultural field. And so they're manipulating the environment in more complex ways. So next, let's take a look at some example societies in each of these different categories and think about how their mode of subsistence may relate to their perceived separation of humanity versus nature. The assigned reading for this module focuses on how different foraging groups think about humanity versus nature. Foragers, also known as hunter-gatherers, collect all food and all the resources from nature. They tend to have social systems that rely on sharing. There are rules that enforce reciprocal sharing, like individuals could be shunned if they didn't share enough. And especially hunters share their meat widely, which makes sense because they don't have refrigeration. So if you take down a large food item, you might as well share it with your small community so that everybody gets to eat before the meat goes bad. Here are some quotes from the reading. The environment gives the wherewithal of life to people, not in return for appropriate conduct, but unconditionally. There's a cosmic economy of sharing. Hunters often respect the power of animals. Human and animal share a common existential status. So nature is seen as a provider, and wild animals are seen as not so different from humans. Our first example foraging society are the Mbuti hunter-gatherers of the DRC, located here in Central Africa. They live in a tropical rainforest where they hunt wild animals and gather foods, plant foods from the forest. In the Mbuti language, the forest is referenced in interpersonal terms as a parent. And this is not meant metaphorically. The Mbuti refer to the forest as the parent of humanity, and in their spiritual belief system, they recognize that people beg food from the forest in the same way that a child might beg treats from its mother, and the forest provides. Here is another example foraging society, the Batek hunter-gatherers of peninsular Malaysia. They live here on the map. And in Batek belief systems, people are emotionally and spiritually connected to the plants, the wild animals, and the deities that they perceive co-inhabit the rainforests in which they all live. All of these things, plants, animals, forest deities that they believe in their spiritual system, are all beings. And because they co-inhabit the same forest, they're all interdependent on one another. And so Batek peoples relate to these entities in the forest the same as you would to a family member. And in their language, this is described with an emotional connection and a spiritually intimate connection, the same way that I might feel with my immediate family members. Consider this third example of a foraging society, Cree hunters of Canada. In the Cree belief system, humans are only one form of a person, and each type of animal is another form of person. So you can imagine these are hunters, they rely on animals for food, but the hunted animals are considered to have a person status, and so they are honored, and there are rituals honoring these hunted animals. And this is a social act. In this belief system, the animal has some agency and decides to give itself up to the hunter. So the animal-human spiritual partnership provides for the people. Here is a quote from your reading. Respectful activity towards the animals enhances the readiness with which they, the animals, give themselves or are given by God to the hunters. And so in this belief system, people can influence the success of hunts by treating animals reverently. Now let's turn our attention to horticulturalists who typically have a slightly different view on the differences between the things of nature and the things of mankind. What we noted with the foragers is there was a blending of humanity and nature. They weren't necessarily occupying separate realms the way that we think about it in the Western paradigm. Horticulturalists are societies in which each family owns its own garden from which they provide themselves the majority of their calories. So nature, often in horticulturalist belief systems, is inclined to help humans, but only if not offended. Here's a quote from our reading. The environment is likened to an ancestor, which yields its bounty only in return for favors rendered. And we don't know much about how horticulturalists typically think about animals because it varies, which was not so much the case with foragers, who all typically revered animals, the animals that they were hunting, and often ascribe a person or person-like status to them. Not so with horticulturalists. The Yanomamo are an example of a horticulturalist society. They live in Venezuela and Brazil. They convert rainforests into plantain gardens. Then they cultivate these gardens, continuously weed them, remove pests, so they're constantly at odds with nature in a way because weeds are coming in, pests are coming in. And if you've ever gardened, you have probably done this too. The Yanomamo also hunt and gather from the forest, though, so they have a mixed strategy. Here is a quote from an ethnography about the Yanomamo. The Yanomamo separate themselves invidiously from the animals and point out as proudly as we Americans do that humans have culture and the animals do not. The Yanomamo language dichotomizes things of the forest from things of the village in the same way that American culture might dichotomize nature versus culture. And here's an interesting tidbit. Sometimes animals are captured from the forest, like a baby monkey, and they're brought into the village as a pet. Now, even though the Yanomamo might eat that type of, in this example, it's a monkey, once an individual monkey is brought into the village as a pet, then it's never at risk of being eaten because it has been converted from a thing of nature into a thing of human, the human realm. Now let's consider pastoralists. These are societies that rely on herbivores that require large tracts of land for grazing. Ownership of grazelands is typically uncommon among pastoralists worldwide, and predators are seen as wild animals that threaten the herd. And since the herd is the livelihood of the family, predators are enemies. So nature in this way is to be navigated. Pastoralists, as I mentioned previously in this video, often dichotomize two types of animals, wild ones and domesticated ones. They're kept separate. Domesticates are protected and nurtured and kept separate from wild animals that could prey upon them. And domesticates are important. But there's a variation in whether the society views each type of animal as property to be exploited or a family member, like imagine having a dairy cow versus a house dog. Consider the Maasai herders of East Africa as an example of a pastoralist society. Among the Maasai, a man accumulates status through the size and composition of his herd. They herd cattle, they also herd goats. The animals are his wealth. There are no bank accounts, it's just the number of animals that you own. And then these animals are used, the goats are milked for food, the cattle can be slaughtered for food, but they're often traded. And what is very important in a man's life is being able to afford a bride by trading for her with her father's family a number of animals. And it's said that in Maasai culture, the going rate for a young, beautiful bride is 2 cows or an entire herd of goats. Dogs among Maasai culture are valued as protectors of the herd. Dogs are man's ally against nature. And so here we have the separation of two different types of animals, those that are our friends those that we can exploit and serve as our money, versus the wild animals that threaten our wealth, the predators. Consider another example pastoralist society, the Duka reindeer herders of Mongolia. They live here in the far north of Mongolia in a type of environment called the taiga, which is very harsh. It's a landscape of swamps and coniferous forest. It gets very cold. It's just south of the Siberian tundra. Very few wild animals can live here. Caribou are one type of wild animal that can live here. When tamed, a caribou becomes a reindeer. It's the same animal. The caribou refers to the wild type. The reindeer refers to the tamed type that is herded by the Duka. Tamed reindeer are the only domesticated animals, in fact, that can survive in this harsh environment. You can't keep laying hens because it's too cold and they die. You can't keep goats. You can't keep cattle. People have tried, but those other types of animals cannot exist in this very harsh environment. And it's difficult to garden. They do garden part of the year, but it's doesn't receive a whole lot of sunlight this far north, so that's not how they get the majority of their calories throughout the year. The Duka believe that people have entered a land that belongs to the wild caribou. And so in their belief system, they believe that humans have become wildized. It's called the Wildernessation of Humans. Humans were able to enter the taiga, this incredibly harsh landscape, with the help of the caribou who already lived there, which the humans domesticated, and then they milk them, they eat them, they ride them, they hitch them to sleighs. The reindeer provide many of the required resources for the Duka to exist. So culturally, there is a solidarity perceived between people and these tamed reindeer who cohabit such a challenging space. Each relies on the other for survival. The human relies on the reindeer. The domesticated reindeer relies on the human. And the Duka have no cognitive separation between being a person versus a reindeer. Both are entities. Family can include both. So the reindeer, the tamed reindeer that the humans take stewardship of, not the wild caribou, but the tamed reindeer, they're considered members of the family. In their spiritual belief system, animals and humans are equal. There's no supremacy. They're considered equal entities under the spirits. Animals are given to human hunters, and humans are given to animals upon death. You may have read about sky burial. So in this society, people are not buried underground. They are ritually laid out in the landscape, and their bodies are then consumed by wild animals, birds and other predators and scavengers, and so they're returned to nature. And so there's this cosmic circle of life described by the Duka spiritual belief system that connects humans and animals. I ran across this meme and decided to include it here because while reading about how the Duka perceive their reindeer as members of their family, it definitely reminded me of how I feel about my dog. And in this meme, we can clearly see that this dog and the lady are in agreement about who gets to sit on the couch, who's considered a member of the family. There seems to be some understanding here that the dog and the human are not completely separate classes of entity. I almost said person, classes of entity. And so there's variation even within our own culture between individuals about how we perceive the appropriateness of separating animals from humans or separating nature from the things of humanity. In conclusion, there's variation in society's perspectives on nature, and these likely impact conservation efforts. If nature is considered separate from the human realm, then the health of each could be at odds. So this may foster an oppositional stance, nature versus humanity. If, however, humans are interwoven into the natural world, there's daily engagement like we see between foragers and the environments in which they coexist with wild animals, then the health of each co-inhabitant of this ecosystem may be viewed as tied to the other, and there's more of an interdependent type of relationship going on. And so whichever culture you come from, if it's more oppositional versus more interdependent, this very likely influences how you perceive environmental protections and conservation efforts should take shape. Among anthropologists, there is increasing awareness that humans are deeply enmeshed with other non-human life. And so there's a growing understanding that we have a collective enmeshed future, humans and non-human species. This has led to the invention of something called a multi-species ethnography. This is an ethnography designed to consider the interactions of all species living in a particular space. It could be a particular country that the anthropologist is studying, or it could be the entire planet. And the goal is to see the world from a more than human perspective. So you're zooming out from your human-centric viewpoint and thinking about how perhaps an environmental policy could impact not just humanity, our economy, our politics, our health, but you would also give equal time to a consideration of how those policies may affect plants, animals, other aspects of the living ecosystem. And so the question is, might shifting to this more than human perspective help us move beyond current environmental destruction that characterizes the Anthropocene? Keeping all of that in mind, here are your discussion seeds for this week. I look forward to reading your responses. Bye.